some chairs available on this side. There's one up here.
This one's okay.
And if you need more, I can go get more. But does it look like everybody's gonna I think we're good.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. We have Elanor Seaton, who's going to be talking about racial discrimination experiences amongst Black youth. I want to welcome you, first of all, from the Francis McClellan Institute for Children, Youth, and Families. This institute is honoring Frances McClellan, who was a business leader and philanthropist here in Arizona. Her family was the ones that founded Shamrock Foods. And Frances was an amazing woman, very resilient, overcame childhood illnesses, and really became a wonderful advocate for children and women and people with disabilities. And so we always remember her. Oh, no, it's okay. Thank you. This is the Pamela Turbeville Speaker Series, so it's because of her support that we're able to have wonderful speakers like Dr. Seaton here with us today. We have speakers almost once a month, and their videos are they're archived on our website. So you can go back and see if there's any topics of interest for you and watch those videos on the internet. And today we have Elanor Seaton, who is an associate professor at Arizona State University. She is in the Social and Family Dynamics group at the T. Denny Sanford School of Family and Human Dynamics Research Institute. She's trained as a developmental psychologist. She completed her postdoctoral work at Program for Research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan. She studies racial discrimination and racial identity with African American and Caribbean Black youth. Her work focuses on resilience and positive youth development because she's interested in learning how it is that some Black youth thrive despite the kind of pervasive adversities that they face in society. She's an associate editor for the Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology Journal. She has current projects that are looking at the development of new measures of discrimination that examine the intersection of race and gender. She's also working on a new pilot project that examines cortisol levels using biomarker specimens with African American college students. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So this is kind of weird because I'm tall. Is this okay if I stand here? It's like, I'm tall. Dre is nice and short, but I've got long legs, so, okay. Am I speaking loud enough? Can everybody hear me? Okay, so, there it is. Let me just say I'm very happy to be here. I consider some of the people here great friends and great colleagues, so I'm very honored to be here and participate in the speaker series. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing and then where I'm headed. I would prefer, unless you have a clarifying question, if you hold all questions to the end so that I can finish my presentation. Okay. So I like to give everyone an overview, so if you take a little nap and then you come back in, you know where we are. So I'm going to talk about my theoretical frameworks. I'm going to give you an overview of the data set. I'm going to talk about 2 different studies. Then I'm going to tell you about my future research, and then I'm going to leave you with some take-home points, because I want you to think about things the way I want you to think about it. Okay? Because I'm doing the talk, that's what I like to do. So I always think it's important to identify the theories that frame our research, that have influenced our work. So I like to do that whenever I give a talk. And I would say there are 4 seminal theories that influence my work presently and have in the past. Of course, the first one would be Bronfenbrenner. I'm a trained developmental scientist. For us to not like Bronfenbrenner would be sacrilegious. But Bronfenbrenner was one of the first developmental psychologists to talk about the fact that people are embedded in environmental systems that range from immediate settings, like micro settings, up to the broader culture, like macro settings. So some of us may take that for granted today, but it was not taken for granted when Bronfenbrenner started writing. So Cynthia Garcia Cole and Margaret Bill Spencer developed frameworks building on Bronfenbrenner's theory about environmental systems. However, their theories were groundbreaking because they articulated the constructs relevant for children of color. like racism, like racial discrimination. And more specifically, they talked about the fact that racial discrimination negatively impacts developmental processes at micro and macro levels. So they built on Bromford-Bunner's idea, but brought into focus more what we need to think about for underrepresented youth. And then last but not least, intersectionality is also very influential in how I think about my research. And intersectionality started in the legal realm. It comes out of critical race theory. But in short, it argues that race, gender, and class are intersectional systems of structural inequality, and which place people at different social locations so that people have advantages and disadvantages based on their membership and identities attached to these systems of structural inequality. So in short, when we think about domains of oppression, like racism, like sexism, they are not independent systems, but they intersect to create unique forms of oppression. So gendered racism or racialized sexism. And so this has been really influential for me in thinking about how Black youth find themselves in different social locations based on these systems or structural systems of inequality. So this is my theoretical background, so to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about my data set. It's called DERBY. It's an acronym, Daily Experiences of Race for Black Youth. It includes a survey component, a qualitative component, and a daily diary component. And so the daily diary component tends to be less familiar, but this is an example of the experiential sampling procedure in which you sample between person and within person variation across time. So you either sample multiple time points within a day or multiple time points over a series of days or weeks. But the idea is that you're looking for within person variation as well as between person variation across time. So these are the three components of the study. And I recruited Black youth in school settings, on Facebook, in Black churches, and then Black teen components attached to the Black Greek letter organizations. I'm going to talk more about that later. So 4 different strategies for recruiting the kids to participate in my study. So let me talk about my Facebook ad. Who's on Facebook? I thought everybody would raise their hand. Oh, wow. Okay. So now this is pre-Russia. Okay, let me just say that. So that's very important. I ran this ad on Facebook targeting kids between the ages of 13 and 18. So you can run ads on Facebook. Facebook does not collect information about race, ethnicity, but you can target based on other characteristics. So I targeted 13 to 18 in the continental US. So the kids saw this. Hey, are you a teenager? Do you want to make some money? Right? Enough said, right? And the peak times for teenagers used to be Thursday night from 7 p.m. to Sunday at 11 p.m. So I ran this over a course of weekends trying to recruit kids. Now, if they saw this ad and they clicked on the ad, it took them to another page. But approximately 124 million kids saw that ad I just showed you. About 34,000 actually clicked on the ad. Now, even if they clicked on the ad, I needed to know if they fit my study criteria, which was, were they of African descent? So 34,000 clicked on the ad, and then that took them to another page where I asked them, hey, a bunch of 10 different questions about teenagers. The only one I cared about, are you of African descent? Of that, about less than 2,000 actually completed the 10 questions, again, which was to tell me, hey, are they of African descent or not? Because Facebook does not, well, if they collect that information, you can't target people based on that information. So about 2,000 actually told me, answered the 10 questions. Again, whether they were of African descent. And of that, about 1,800 fit my criteria. They were of African descent. And that took them to another page where I asked them for their residential address because I practice active consent. So I needed to send them parental consent forms and adolescent assent forms. So about 1,800 told me, yeah, okay, here's my address. So we mailed out research packets and returned envelopes. Now this is where you see the attrition. 1,800 went out, about 400 came back. Makes sense. I'm relying on teenagers. So I was happy for the 400. And of about the 400, about 226 participated in at least one of the study components. So this was my first time running ads on Facebook. I really wanted to know if it was a feasible way to recruit adolescents around different parts of the country, given that I was only living in one part of the country, I would say it's a mixed bag, but I can talk about that later in terms of effective or not. So this is how I recruited my Facebook sample. Okay. All right, I think this is. So the first study I'm going to talk about, I examined racial discrimination and racial identity, looking at daily moderation. I wanted to understand if racial identity moderates daily racial discrimination experiences. So my definition of racial discrimination aligns with that of David Williams, James Jackson, and Woody Nakes. The idea that discrimination consists of dominant group behaviors and actions which result in differential and systematic and negative effects on subordinate ethnic racial groups. So this is a structural and systemic issue, not at an individual level per se. Ranges from individual to institutional. And prior research using this technique found that Black adolescents experience racial discrimination on a daily basis. And the average in that study was 2 per day. But the range was 1 to 4, and this is per day, out of potential 18 incidents. So pretty frequently, if you think about over the course of one day, you're experiencing 2 per day. It's also been demonstrated racial discrimination is bad for kids. Now, who needed to be told that? Anybody? So it's not a good thing to be discriminated against because of your race, ethnicity. And April Benner and colleagues are doing a meta-analysis, and they've demonstrated this empirically. Over the course of studies, they found that the correlation between racial discrimination and socio-emotional distress is about 0.24. Socio-emotional distress includes internalizing symptoms like depression or anxiety, internalizing symptoms as well as distress, depression, and anxiety. So 0.24, which is not an insignificant correlation. So it's a risk factor for non-white youth, namely African American, Latino, and Asian American youth. And in the same study that I just referenced, daily racial discrimination experiences predicted next day depressive symptoms. So that means if I experienced something on Monday, I was depressed on Tuesday. So again, racial discrimination, not good for minority youth, definitely not good for Black youth. However, one of our esteemed psychologists, Bill Cross, has theoretically argued, so racial identity should buffer these experiences. So racial identity should sort of mitigate the negative effects of racial discrimination experience, in theory. And my definition of racial identity is the significance and meaning that people attach to being members of their racial group. Now, what I want you to notice about this definition is it's not prescribing how one should feel about their racial group, but it's simply arguing the significance and meaning that people attach to their racial group. Some people may attach a lot of significance and meaning, some people may attach less significance and meaning. And my theoretical framework, articulated by Robert Sellers, the multidimensional model of racial identity, argues that racial identity includes 4 different dimensions: salience, regard, centrality, and ideology. However, in the current study, I only examined racial centrality and the regard dimensions, which I'm going to define right now. So again, racial centrality, the extent to which a person considers race to be an important part of their self-concept. So again, notice, it's not assuming race is an important part of someone's self-concept, but whether or not it is, it could be an important part, high racial centrality, could not be an important part, low racial centrality. Private regard, this is an individual's affective attitudes about their racial group, and in this case, African American. So private regard, the extent to which a person feels either positively or negatively about being African American. Notice, no prescribed way, but it could be either or. And public regard is the extent to which a person who is African American believes that the broader society views African Americans either positively or negatively. So again, no prescription about how a person should feel, but recognizing that some people can feel positively or negatively, or can have high racial centrality or low racial centrality. This becomes important when we think about buffering potential. And so in the context of racial discrimination, certain dimensions have been found to buffer racial discrimination experiences. So high racial centrality levels. African American adolescents who believe being African American is important to my identity. That's been found to buffer racial discrimination experiences. High private regard levels. African American youth who believe I feel good about being African American. That's been found to buffer racial discrimination experiences. And low public regard levels, the idea that the broader society views African Americans negatively, also been found to buffer racial discrimination experiences among African American adolescents using survey data. So it's particular dimensions of these racial identity constructs that have been found to buffer these experiences. Now, all of those studies use survey research, either cross-sectional or longitudinal, but when we think about daily experiences, there seems to be some consistency and there seems to be some inconsistency. So 2 studies have examined the moderating potential of racial identity with daily racial discrimination experiences. And they found, 1, rather than buffering these experiences, high racial centrality levels exacerbate these experiences among African American college students. Whereas consistently, high private regard levels and low public regard levels also buffer the across-day relation. The across-day relation simply means longitudinal. Monday predicting Tuesday, Monday predicting Wednesday, the average of that. So high private regard and low public regard buffered, but high racial centrality exacerbated. Now again, this has been conducted among African American college students. So it's not clear if these findings will replicate for adolescents. And so the current question, do high racial centrality levels, high private regard levels, and low public regard levels moderate this daily relationship? And so basically I examine your basic moderation model. Who's seen this before? Just a basic moderator model. However, because I'm looking at this at a daily level, I can assess within and across day relations. So there could be moderation for within or exacerbation for within and the reverse for across. So I can look at this in 2 different levels. Okay, so who did I interview? 103 Black youth who participate in the daily diary component. They range in age from 14 to 18, no surprise there. Average age a little bit less than 16. This sample consisted of primarily females. That's a whole other conversation about why it's difficult to recruit male adolescents. I can come back to that. So I like to allow my kids to choose their self-labels. And so as you can see, the overwhelming majority chose African American, but a significant minority chose Afro-Latino, biracial, multiracial, Caribbean Black, or African. Again, the primary criteria was that they were of African descent, and as you can see, they chose racial labels reflecting how they saw themselves. So a small minority of the sample was recruited from schools in a southeastern city, but the majority of this sample came from adolescents recruited on Facebook, which I've talked about. So all adolescents completed a baseline survey, again, try to get baseline estimates of these variables. A week later, they began completing the daily survey. So once a day in the evening, they completed a daily survey, which primarily included the discrimination questions. And SurveyMonkey was used for the survey completion. All adolescents were compensated $30. This was the best part of the study, trust me, from their perspective, trust me, getting their $30. So in order to assess racial discrimination, I use the daily life experiences subscale. This assesses the frequency of racial daily hassles. So again, they completed this every night for 14 days. A sample item includes how often have you had your ideas ignored because of your race. And again, the time frame was in the past day. They completed this in the evening. Responses range from none to 2 or more times a day. In order to assess identity, I included the multidimensional inventory of Black identity. Ooh, I'm stumbling over words. This was developed by my mentoring colleagues, Robert Sellers and some of his former students. Again, they completed this every day for 14 days. This assesses racial centrality, private regard, public regard. A sample racial centrality item is I have a strong attachment to other Black people. A sample private regard item, I feel good about Black people. And a sample public regard item, in general, others respect Black people. They also completed the CESD short every day. This is an assessment of depressive symptomatology. Very, very, very popular and common measure used among adolescent samples. And a sample item includes, I felt depressed. So they completed all of these measures every night for 14 nights. Okay, so for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to talk about the significant interaction terms, because this would have been really messy if I included the main effects. But as you can see, for the within day analysis, so within the course of one day, the racial discrimination by racial centrality interaction was significant, as was the racial discrimination by private regard interaction was significant, whereas the racial discrimination by public regard was not, or within day, so concurrent analyses. So when we graph this, what we see is that rather than buffering, high racial centrality levels tend to be exacerbating. So on the days when Black adolescents reported that their racial centrality levels were higher than usual, there was an increase in depressive symptoms when they experienced racial discrimination for high racial centrality levels, which again, I was hoping there would be some moderation. There appears to be exacerbation for high racial centrality levels. We see something similar for high private regard levels. Again, on the days when adolescents experienced higher than usual private regard levels, there was an increase in depressive symptomatology when they experienced racial discrimination. So again, rather than buffering, high private regard appears to be exacerbating as well in the course of one day. So within day analysis. When we look at the across day analyses, we see that is this the,
Yes.
is it working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Like I see it. Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay. So we see that the interaction terms for racial discrimination and racial centrality are non-significant, but we have a significant interaction for racial discrimination by public regard. Again, this is a cross day. This is looking at sort of over the 14 days. And when we graph this, again, we see this exacerbation. So low public regard levels, on the days when Black youth report low public regard levels that are lower than normal, there's an increase in depression when they experience racial discrimination. So low public regard levels appear to be exacerbating rather than buffering. So in short, not what I wanted to see, which happens. Okay, so exacerbation for the within day and also the across day. So unfortunately, because I wanted to see moderation or buffering, but the results are consistent with prior research, some of the research conducted among college students. So why is this happening? Some people theoretically have argued that high racial centrality might exacerbate the effects of racial discrimination and result in negative mental health outcomes. So the idea is that people for whom race is central to their identity might react more strongly to racial discrimination experiences when it happens, compared to people for whom race is not a central part of their identity. Hence the reason why you might see the exacerbation. Now the key question is, why do we see exacerbation at a daily level, but not when we look at survey, either cross-sectional or longitudinal research? So we're seeing this in the moment, but not necessarily when people use other time periods. High private regard levels. So it's possible that people who have high private regard levels, they feel positively about being Black, and their immediate response to racial discrimination experiences may be negative. Now this is based on some lab studies in which they manipulated racial discrimination incidents, either blatant or subtle, and they find that the response to these incidents, blatant or subtle racial incidents that occur in a lab setting, the response depends on whether or not people have high private regard levels. And that those with high private regard levels evidence negative emotions immediately after the event, but that goes away. So again, the daily analysis may be replicating what people in the lab have been able to demonstrate, the immediate response to this, which again, this is for the within day analysis, may be negative, but over time becomes less negative. Empirical question. And low public regard levels. Now this is the only one we see sort of this longitudinal effect. And Rodney Clark and colleagues have argued that low public regard may be like a racism-related vigilance, or this psychological predisposition to see events as racist, whether they are or not. And Rodney Clark and colleagues have argued not only is this a negative, but it's been linked to negative health outcomes among adolescents and adults. So it's possible that within this short time frame, because again, low public regard was exacerbating across the entire 14-day period, this may be akin to this vigilance perspective, this predisposition, which is why we see this exacerbating factor. Again, empirical question. Under what conditions will we see exacerbation compared to moderation? I personally think there are some important third variables that we're not talking about, but we can come back to that during the Q&A. So for my second study, I wanted to dig more into my intersectionality interest. I wanted to start to understand sort of the intersection of race and gender among Black youth and how this operates using a mixed methods design. So first I looked at the literature to see, well, what does the literature say about gender differences and racial discrimination? Pretty much it's a mixed bag. So 3 studies have reported no gender differences in racial discrimination experiences among African American youth. 1 study reported that African American girls experienced more than males. 2 studies indicated that African American males reported more than females. So who knows what's happening based on prior work, right? However, Simone Ypsilanti is a sociologist who conducted an ethnographic study of African American adolescents being bused to predominantly white suburban high school. And I think her findings shed light on possibly what's happening. And what she found was that when it came to negative stereotypes regarding their academic abilities, both males and females reported these experiences from peers and teachers. There was no gender difference that emerged around academic abilities. However, once she delved into the social realm, this is where we began to see the effect of gender. So the African American males were more likely to be included in social events on the weekends with their white peers, and they also freely dated their white female peers. However, African American females were excluded from these social events, and they reported in her ethnographic research that neither their white or African American male peers considered them romantically desirable. So again, academically, similar experiences. But in the social realm is when we began to see there's some differences here where gender and race may be intersecting. So I wanted to delve into this and find out possibly maybe what's going on. So I use a mixed methods exploratory sequential design to probe the intersection of gender and race among Black adolescents. In the quantitative component, I examine whether African American adolescents' reports of racial discrimination experiences vary by gender. And in the qualitative component, I wanted to see if the role of gender would emerge in their narratives of their racialized experiences. So I conducted the quantitative first, then I conducted the qualitative, hence the reason why I use the word sequential. Okay, so my quantitative study included the 344 Black adolescents who participated in the survey component of Derby. Again, the mean age is around 16. This sample included 1/3 males, 2/3 females. Again, the racial labels, overwhelming majority chose African American, but as you can see, 25% chose the other labels available to them. It's very important for me that the kids self-identify how they choose to identify themselves along racial lines. So half of the sample was recruited from schools in the southeastern city. And again, the schools completed the survey using SurveyMonkey. And the other half were recruited on Facebook. And they also completed the survey using Facebook. And again, the best part of this is when you give adolescents their money. They all receive, trust me, it's the best part of the study for them. And me, because that means they're finished. All of the kids were compensated $20. Okay, so I used the Peer Perpetrator Scale, which was developed by Naomi Way and colleagues. This is 21 items that assess the frequency of peer racial discrimination experiences in school settings. So it's from peers within the school domain. Sample item includes how often do you feel that other students in school treat you with less respect because of your race. The Adult Perpetrator Scale assesses the frequency of racial discrimination experiences from adults outside of school settings. So again, random adults outside of school. So the perpetrator changes, the domain changes. And the sample item includes how often do you feel that adults you don't know outside of school treat you like a troublemaker because of your race. So we have peers in school settings, adults outside of school settings. All right, what do we find? No gender differences in the peer racial discrimination experiences in school settings. So males and females reported equivalent amounts of these experiences. No significant gender difference emerged. However, the females report more adult racial discrimination experiences than their male counterparts. So outside of school, females are reporting more experiences with unknown random adults outside of school, which again, contrary to kind of what we saw in the beginning. So 9 months after the quantitative component was completed, I conducted the qualitative component because I wanted to probe further and see if I could disentangle with what's going on here. So the sample includes 42 Black adolescents who participated in the qualitative component, and these are not equivalent samples. So the youth who participated in the qualitative component are not the same adolescents who participated in the survey component. The mean age, again, 15.6, 37% male, 63% female. Overwhelmingly female. Again, if someone could tell me how to recruit Black males, please talk to me during the Q&A. Okay, so the participants recruited through Black youth church ministries and teen programs of Black Greek letter organizations. So let me talk about this last setting. So the National Panhellenic Council includes 9 Black Greek fraternities and sororities. All of them have components that cater to children and adolescents. So for example, I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We have a teen component. We also have a component that caters to girls in middle school. So I recruited adolescents attached to all of these components for the fraternities and sororities. So as you would imagine, boys and girls, because the fraternities cater to boys, sororities cater to girls. And again, these programs are designed for enrichment, edification, cultural heritage, and pride. So this is where I recruited potential participants. I conducted, and I say I because I did, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 18 youth, 6 males and 12 females. All of these youth were compensated $50. Again, the best part of the study. And I also conducted 4 focus groups among 24 youth, 6 participants per focus group. And these youth were compensated $25. I say I because I actually conducted the focus groups as well. The interview time ranged from 60 to 90 minutes. Some kids talked more than others, but for the most part, 90 minutes was the maximum time that they all talked. I asked them questions in the following domains: school, neighborhood, employment, retail settings, hair, and dating. So let me talk about the questions that I asked. I'll give you a sample. So in school, have you ever had a teacher question whether you belonged in a specific class? Why do you think this happened? Now, I asked this question because I wanted the kids to tell me their attribution for it. So if they said, yes, this happened, I wanted them to tell me why they believe this occurred. I did not want to prime race. So I asked them to give me their own attributions for their own experiences. So for the dating questions, have you ever dated someone who is non-Black? Why or why not? Specifically worded, so not to be heterosexist. Keyword, someone. Hair. Have you ever received attention due to your hair? Why do you think this happened? Again, I wanted the kids to give me their own attribution. So after all of these domain questions were asked, I asked a specific question. Have you ever been treated differently because you are Black? Again, I did not want to prime race. And all of the questions that I asked are based on common measures used to assess racial discrimination among Black youth. But the last question specifically asked about race. This is after they've told me their attributions or not. So there's a specific intent behind this method. Okay, so 3 things emerged from the coding analysis. Gender matters, hair scrutiny, Black boys are hot, Black girls are not. All right, gender matters. So even though the majority of you did not express a belief that one group has a harder time than the other, a small minority did. So 26%, 11 kids, 7 females, 4 males, told me that they believe Black males have a harder time than Black females. And I've included quotes so you can see for yourself what the kids had to say. And all of these are pseudonyms for the kids. So Cece, who is 17, told me, because I'm a Black girl, it's probably easier. I feel like Black boys have it a little harder. Doesn't get any more blunt than that. Blake, who is a 16-year-old male, told me, Black men in society is the lowest form of anything possible. It's the lowest thing you can be. Moving on, Sheba, a 14-year-old female, told me, I think it's worse for Black males than males. And 16-year-old Glory told me to be a black boy and to be smart, it's this big thing. I know a lot of guys, they're extremely intelligent, but they'll act like they're not, just that people will think they're cool. So again, this is just an example of some of the quotes. But again, a small minority felt like it's just harder to be a black boy or a black male than to be a black girl or a black female. The second thing that emerged is what I call hair scrutiny. So about half of the females and one black male reported unwelcome experiences related to whites' curiosity about their hair texture and style. And this was from white peers and white adults. So for example, Chloe told me, I went to get my hair done. The white lady was like, why is your hair soft? And why is it so long and stuff? Deneen told me they, meaning white people, really like to touch my hair, which I can't stand. Now, I emphasize the word unwelcome. So these incidents occur without permission. Tyra, a 16-year-old female, told me the white kids in my class, they touch my hair all the time. And Octavia told me they, white kids in her classes, don't even ask. They just put their hands on it, meaning her hair. And Cece, who's 17 years old, told me they, meaning white people, asked me, are you mixed or something? Or are you totally black given your hair? Now I want to point out, all of these females wore natural hair, meaning not processed, not chemically straightened, not perm. So my hair is natural. So either twist or braids or some variation of that. So all of these females are wearing natural hair and experiencing this from their white peers in school, white adults outside of school. Again, primarily a female experience. And my last thing, black boys are hot, black girls are not. So many participants expressed what I call a colorblind dating ideology, meaning you should date whoever you want, love is love, etc. So for example, Sean captures it perfectly. I mean, whoever you choose to love is whoever you choose to love. Carly told me, if you like someone, then it shouldn't matter if they're black or white. So again, this idea that love is love, you should date who you want. But when I asked, well, have you dated? There's a disparity. So 10 of the 16 male participants, 63%, but only 8 of the female participants, 31%, had actually dated interracially. And this disparity was not lost on my female participants. So Portia told me, I have white girlfriends that have dated black guys, but I don't have any black girlfriends that have dated white guys. And Cece, and at the time of this interview, Cece was dating a white guy. And yet she said, if I see a biracial couple, it's a black boy and a white girl, I don't usually see a black girl and a white boy. Again, at the time, Cece herself was dating a white adolescent male. So the disparity that was evident in their responses to the question was not lost on my black female participants. Now, when I asked, because I asked them, have you dated someone, why or why not? Black males tended to cite 2 reasons, either lack of attractiveness, or they just really saw no difference between dating black or white females. So Greg, who was 17, told me, I've never been too seriously interested in black girls. I've met physically attractive black girls, but none that I'd want to be in a relationship with. And then Andre, who had dated a white female, told me she, referring to this white ex-girlfriend, wasn't a racial person. She really liked black people. So my males told me there's really no difference between dating black or white girls, or just not attracted to black girls. Females had a different experience. They felt like their white male counterparts weren't interested in them, and then they were concerned about being taken seriously as girlfriends. So Brandy told me, I don't feel like the white guys at my school are really open to that being interracial dating. And Sophia, who was 17, I've heard from white guys, you have to be careful because a lot of times black women are looked at as objects. They, meaning white guys, would hook up with a black girl, but wouldn't necessarily date her. So it occurs to me in this moment, do I need to define hookup? No? Okay. Okay. Because again, I take for granted, but I'm like, wait, hookup is the youngest term. Okay. So the black girls were worried about being perceived seriously as girlfriends and not hookup partners or booty calls. Different perception from my black males. So in closing, even though the quantitative results indicate no differences in peer racial discrimination experiences, Yet the females report more adult racial discrimination experiences. So no differences in peers, differences with the adults. However, the qualitative results complicate this because they indicate black females are disproportionately impacted by hair scrutiny, which again is unwelcome touching, unwelcome comments from peers and white peers and adults, either in school or outside of school, related to wearing their hair naturally. And black females also find fewer interracial dating opportunities than black males, despite the fact that they equally espouse this colorblind dating ideology. So again, there seems to be some differences that emerge as a result of the intersection of race and gender. And yet, despite these findings related to hair or dating, a small minority of youth believe that black males have a harder time. Now, I'll admit this is the most puzzling part of this data, that a minority actually believe that black males have it harder, despite the fact that I just told you about two findings that seem to negatively impact black females more than black males. So again, future work needs to disentangle that. Nevertheless, these point to how the intersection of race and gender are important, because hair scrutiny occurs because they are black females, not because they're black, and not because they're female. And the dating finding again appears to be related to the fact that they're black females, not because they're black and not because they're female, but because of both of those, being at the intersection of being a black adolescent female, again, race and gender. So of course I have to acknowledge my limitations. The samples were predominantly female rather than having equivalent numbers of males. Having equal numbers of males and females may alter the findings. It's an empirical question. I use convenient samples, so of course results can't be generalized to other black youth. And social desirability may have affected participants' willingness to divulge their true feelings. So even though I gleaned some great information, I may not have been able to capture sort of specifically how black youth feel about these issues, given that people may have been unwilling to share their true feelings. So I have to acknowledge that. Okay, so where am I going in the future? I'm a measurement person, psychometrician, so I'm developing a measure for black adolescents that captures these experiences that occur at the intersection of race and gender. I'm also interested in looking at the intersection of racial discrimination, racial identity, and pubertal development. And so puberty is a natural process. If you're a mammal, you undergo pubertal development. It happens. You start, you finish, boom. However, I want to understand how pubertal development is complicated by the intersection of race and gender. So it's forcing me to go down. I've got to go to kids, starting with 10, because puberty is starting earlier. But I'm interested in understanding this pubertal process and how it's complicated by race and gender. I also would like to conduct Derby 2.0. I'm interested in understanding how discrimination gets under the skin. This is a phrase that you'll see that's very common. How does discrimination impact people from a health perspective? So how does it impact different processes that occur beyond our consciousness? So I'd like to replicate this study with the incorporation of biomarker indicators. So I'm specifically interested in CRP, which is an indicator of inflammation, but also cortisol, dysregulated cortisol outcomes. Again, trying to understand if adolescence is the period when we start to see health disparities that show up in adulthood, that are very clear in the broader society regarding physical health indicators, if the beginning of these or the genesis of these are during the adolescent period. So I'm interested in understanding, like my fellow colleagues, how does discrimination get under the skin? Okay, so I'm going to tell you what I want you to think when I leave here, and you can discard it or not. So hopefully I convince you racial discrimination is a pervasive and harmful stressor. Unfortunately, racial identity may exacerbate rather than buffer daily experiences. Discriminatory incidents can vary in quantity and quality based on the intersection of race and gender. And I think undergirding both of these studies is the idea that we need racial discrimination measures that accurately and comprehensively capture the experiences of black youth, which is sorely lacking in our current literature. And with that, I say thank you.
We'll go ahead and take some questions.
Hi.
Hi. I had a question about one to your YouTube know. You're looking at biomarkers, and I know looking at biomarkers and I'm looking at more like kind of a genetics kind of mind frame. And I know from previous studies on Holocaust survivors that they went through this whole mental and emotional trauma, and from that it turned on certain gene makers and producers, and that led into a lot of disorders in their
Psychiatric disorders?
What's that?
What kind of disorders? Psychiatric?
Like disorders, like eating disorders,
Okay,
sleeping
psychiatric.
disorders, a lot of thinking or like kind of like positivity, and so in that kind of mind frame, they had those genes and that was hereditary, and so their offsprings and the following generations have experienced all of that because of the trauma and because of the discrimination and the stress that has gone through them. And would that be another biomarker that you could implement into your?
So the only person I know who's looking at the gene level is Gene Brody. He's a researcher at the University of Georgia. He started a study among African American youth when they were 12. Now they're in their late 20s, and he's collected gene information. In the few papers that I've read, he's definitely demonstrated that there's a susceptibility based on racial discrimination experiences. So I'm not interested in going that far. I'm not a G by E person. I think it's interesting, but I absolutely buy the conceptual argument that when trauma happens to a group of people, it alters the fundamental foundation of their cells and their body, and we see this in subsequent generations. So there is work that links the racial discrimination experiences that Black women experience. It influences their infant in utero and also after birth. So we can see the effects of racial discrimination experience at least a generation later. Again, I think all of that again proves that this is bad for people, you know. So yeah, I'm not interested in the G by E, but I follow that peripherally because I think it's still the same argument. It's bad as negative effects, not just for the person, but also for subsequent generations. So, absolutely.
I'm really interested in your Facebook component because I think the role of social media on racial identity has changed over the course of the years. So what's really great is for ethnic minority youth, they are able to see images on social media about Black girl magic or Black boy excellence, and that would hopefully really reinforce this racial identity that's met with high regard for how they identify. Have you explored the possibility that social media could be both a place of maybe positive and negative experiences for?
So I haven't, but I have a colleague who has, and she definitely finds that minority youth experience racial discrimination in online settings, but also that racial identity can buffer some of those settings. For me, I think that requires measures that articulate what happens in social media. And other than this one colleague who has a measure about online racial discrimination, we don't really have sort of online racial identity measures. But I think, as you said, it can be harmful. It can also be beneficial. I guess it depends on the spaces where kids find themselves. It's not just Facebook. I would say it's Twitter. I would also say it's Instagram. I would also say it's YouTube because they watch these YouTube videos all day. So I think if we just think about the universe of the internet, what are kids seeing? How are they processing these? I think given our current climate, race is a hot topic, but I don't know how kids are processing what they're seeing. And so I think how the narrative becomes framed also becomes important, but then that links to sort of racial socialization. So in terms of the racial identity, I don't know anyone doing that work, but definitely online racial discrimination is being explored among Black and Latino youth. But great question.
I wanted to look upon the intersections of the race and gender again, and especially within the female or the African American, looking at the hairstyles, like the no traditional hairstyles, that leave it out.
You mean natural?
Yeah, natural.
Okay, natural hairstyles.
And has there been instances where that conflicted between them working in a professional setting? Because I've had several colleagues that we worked in labs together, and they some of our PIs said that, don't come into the lab with your hair that way, but they said that, this is my natural hair and I feel that this is offensive. Has that been an issue? Have you saw that in your...
With my adolescent girls? No. So nobody reported that they were discouraged from work. But again, they're in school settings, which is different from an employment setting. So nobody reported that they were discouraged from wearing their natural hair, at least in my data. They just reported sort of these unwelcome experiences related to wearing natural hair. And again, I want to point out it's only for girls who are not perming or not straightening and their hair ranges, because our texture ranges. But no one reported made to feel like they should not wear their hair like that. But there is research demonstrating that there are cultural rules where Black women are sort of implicitly told that they should straighten their hair, particularly in corporate America. I think those rules are changing. I would say like in the past 15 years or so, there's been a natural hair movement among Black women. So I think the culture is shifting, and that may be changing. I don't work in corporate America, thank God, so I don't know. But there is definitely sort of a natural hair revolution that's occurred. So it'd be interesting to see that if even in corporate America, those rules are becoming more relaxed. But none of my girls told me, teachers told me you can't wear your hair like this. There just seems to be this exotic fascination with I guess I can't think of another way to describe it. Exotic fascination with hair that's not straight, not perms, not blonde, etc. Because it's contrary to white beauty standards, and I think that's what's lying at the heart of this. So.
I have a question. Going back to the pubertal transition. I know that females are more vulnerable to mood disturbances and developing depression during that time. Do you think that would be a special time for maybe Black females that experience discrimination? And how would you disentangle those vulnerabilities and those experiences during that time?
So it's interesting because Black girls start puberty earlier than everyone else, right? Black you start earlier than everyone else. White, Asian American, Latino. Okay. Black girls start early. So girls start earlier than boys. Mm-hmm. Black start earlier than everyone else. So Black girls are the earliest because the average age of menarche in general is 12. For Black girls, it's like 10.5, 11. So they're going through this early. And there's a robust finding that early pubertal development, so you start early, results in negative outcomes in adolescence and adulthood. But we don't see that for Black girls. Given that they start the earliest of everyone, they're the same race and opposite race and same gender and opposite gender counterparts, we don't see the exacerbated negative outcomes compared to white girls who go through puberty earlier. So I have 2 papers that have looked at racial identity as a mitigating factor. And we definitely find sort of Black girls who have certain racial identity beliefs, again, they feel positively about being Black is important to the whole concept, that mitigates that relationship between pubertal time and adverse outcomes. And it also context matters. So we find that this relation between early pubertal timing and negative outcomes occurs for Black girls in predominantly white schools. So again, we don't see the negative association we would expect to see. So there's something else going on that's protecting Black girls. So that's kind of how I ended up there, because they should be killing themselves, so to speak, and they're not. So racial identity becomes important. But I also think racial discrimination is important, because I think if you go through puberty earlier, you have an adult-like body. People assume you're older. You're going to probably get more discrimination experiences. So that's another stress up. So if you're 13 and you look like you're 16, people think you're older because you physically develop. So I also think discrimination becomes important because people perceive you to be older than you really are because you developed early. So no one has looked at that relation, but I have some data where I absolutely find early pubertal timing is linked to more discrimination experiences. So it's like wide open. And the puberty people are like, well, it's just a biological process. Complicated by race and gender.
Right. And I like the strengths based perspective. Like, what is the strengths based perspective, or like what are the protective factors that could be
right? Because they should have the worst outcomes and they don't. And they go through puberty the earliest compared to everyone else, but they don't have these negative effects. So that's kind of how me and my colleague got into it. Like, racial identity, maybe even gender identity. And again, I think part of it is how they feel about their developing bodies, and we know Black girls have more body satisfaction than white girls. The weight gain is not necessarily a bad thing for Black girls like it is for white girls. And that's culturally framing. So I think there are a host of dynamics here that we haven't unpacked related to the simple process that your body is preparing itself for sexual reproduction. So that's what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi.
I have a question about the type of discrimination.
The type of what? Can you speak up?
The type of discrimination behavior, because I noticed that in your interview, most of the behaviors are kind of microaggression. Somehow subtle and covert, and maybe even the perpetrator don't realize they are behave in some unfriendly way. I'm not sure whether there are some major overt behaviors, and I'm curious about whether the type of behavior matters in the moderating role of identity centrality, right? But because for me, it seems that if the behavior is subtle and the individual who behave like this don't realize what they are doing, when the receipt react in a more intense way, they might think that this guy is overreactive, is oversensitive, and maybe in that kind of situations, the black youth might be rejected for their overreaction, but for some more intense overt discrimination, I think maybe the intense reaction might be.
So I'm not sure I understand your question. You started with institutional compared to individual. Are you asking about sort of institutional?
No, it is just
Microaggressions versus what?
Yeah.
Versus what?
So sort of the subtle stuff that the person might not even realize they're doing. Right?
The perpetrator.
Discriminatory versus like a dramatic,
Overt.
overt.
So subtle and blatant.
Subtle and blatant.
Okay.
Because we can get sort of a different kind of moderation
Depending on
by
that.
centrality.
Okay, thank you. So one, I hate the term microaggressions. There's nothing micro about racism, so I hate that term. But again, racial discrimination can be subtle and it can be blatant. So in some of there's a paper that came out this month looking at in-lab settings. The subtle incidences where you saw moderation with public regard, but for the blatant incidents you saw the exacerbation. So I do think there's something to that, like the subtle versus the blatant, because it can range. But I think that's driven by the person's perception, because some people may perceive subtle as blatant and some people may not. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think it matters, but I also think it's driven by perception, because you may perceive subtle and blatant incidents equally. Okay, so for some people, blatant may be worse than subtle. Subtle may be sort of less egregious. But I think that's driven by a person's perception of racism in general. And so if you think they're all bad, your reaction may not change. But if you think one is worse than the other, so for example, nobody called me the N-word, right? But if a teacher doesn't recommend you for AP English, that's blatant to me. But a kid could perceive that as subtle. So I think the idea that something is blatant or subtle depends on that person. Both of those are bad, but a person could rank those. So I think even that perception of what's subtle and blatant isn't going to be equal across you. So I think that's a very important distinction, but I think that's also going to be driven by other things like racial socialization, because it's about how you read these encounters. And some people don't read them all. Sometimes my kids talked about incidents that happened to them, clearly racially driven. Well, why do you think that happened? Oh, I don't know. Everything but race. And in my head, I'm like, are you kidding me? So how you read these incidents depends on all these other factors that we haven't yet begun to unpack, because everybody doesn't read them the same way. And I definitely had kids who were telling me incidents that were clearly racially motivated. And so why do you think this happened? Well, I mean, anything but race. So I thought that was interesting. So everyone's not seeing this. As an adult, I was sitting there like, it's race, race for 800. And they're like, in my head, of course. And they're like, well, I don't know why it happened. Well, I think it's because I think a lot of kids say it's because I'm young, because I'm a teenager. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Okay, all right. So how you perceive that varies across people as well. But that's a great question, the distinction between subtle and blatant.
I wanted to ask about, you use the intersectionality framework to look at gendered racism, or sort of tease that apart a little bit. Have you considered looking at using intersectionality to look at the identity component?
I'm less interested in the identity component, and I'm biased because, again, intersectionality talks about systems of inequality, which result from these identities. So I'm more interested in the systems of inequality because that has to do with power. So my gender identity is salient because of sexism or because of patriarchy. So I'm less interested in the intersection of race and gender as an identity. Maybe one day, but not today. But more interested in oppression and how it advantages and disadvantages people based on social location. So that's just kind of where my interest is in today. And our identities arise from that. But that's not the origin of what we're talking about. So that's probably why I'm less interested in that. But I think that's a great question. I think it's wide open for the field. I only know one person who's doing that work, and she's not in developmental science. So I think it's an open Gioni. I think it's an open question. Probably somebody with
Quick
that.
question about, thank you first for your presentation. I'm Rick Orozco, I'm in secondary education.
What's your name?
Rick Orozco, secondary education.
Okay.
Pleasure. I'm interested in how it is that you plan to collect the cortisone samples. And are you planning to collect them as close to the moment of interest as possible, or how precisely are you planning to do that?
So I'm doing a pilot project right now. It's the bane of my existence among college students to test out this protocol. So what I have my college students, as of yesterday, I have like 94. My goal is 100, and I'm like, these kids drive me crazy. So the protocol that I've been testing out. So again, they do a baseline survey. A week later, they do the 14-day daily surveys. I'm sticking with that because I'm interested in these daily experiences. In the middle of the 14 daily surveys, on days 6, 7, and 8 is when they spit for me. And they spit 3 times a day for 3, so 9 saliva samples. As soon as they wake up, 30 minutes later, before they go to bed. We text them, we email them, we semi-harass them, don't forget to spit, don't forget to spit, don't forget to spit, don't forget to spit. After the third, so they spit in these little tubes we have these Ziploc bags. All they have to do is spit, Ziploc bag, home freezer. After the 3rd day, on the 4th day, we go and retrieve these samples from them because they have to stay frozen. And then we bring them to ASU, and then I ship them to Salametrics. So I've been testing this protocol, like, will people spit? Will people spit? Will people spit? Some people will spit. So, and again, saliva, the best way to get cortisol is usually hair samples. I never feel comfortable asking participants to do anything I wouldn't do. I wouldn't do a hair collection. So spitting is pretty non-invasive. It's just a matter of keeping them on task. Like I said, we text them, we email them, we semi-harass them. Don't forget to spit, don't forget to spit, don't forget to spit. So I've been testing out this protocol. Now these are college students. So far, so good, kind of. We'll see about adolescents. But that's what I do, because you need at least 3 to plot the diurnal slope.
Right. So, and you're assuming that there will be at least some sort of daily.
Well, I'll be able to look at that because, again, the saliva samples are embedded in the middle of this 14 daily survey about discrimination. So 6, 7, and 8. I've got 1 through 14 in theory. In the middle of this, you're spitting for me, so I'll be able to look at that.
And they're journaling too at the same time.
No, they're filling out a daily survey.
Oh, daily.
So we email them, it goes to their little phone, they answer the questions, boop, they're done. So it's designed to be easy. We'll see. Again, bane of my existence right now. I know you've done some. You've done kids, right?
Yeah, I have.
Adolescents?
And I think the point is that you probably aren't going to capture their reactivity to the experience, or you'd have to be assessing it across, right?
Multiple
But
times
you're
over the course of a
capturing
day.
that diurnal pattern, which actually theoretically we think that reactivity over and over again would alter that diurnal pattern.
Right.
So that would be the reason it's almost, you know how hard it is to get people to spit. Imagine adding more time points.
Right. Oh no. 3 is enough. So did you do daily discrimination with the spitting?
I haven't. I've done week to week, but they did, no, we haven't assessed discrimination on the day level, but
Just the
2
spitting.
days each week for 4 weeks.
The discrimination.
Yes.
And then the spitting.
Yes.
So what's the time period between the discrimination and the spitting?
They spit on Thursday, Friday, they reported on Friday their experience of discrimination.
Okay.
So we took an aggregate across the 2 days.
Okay.
What was the interval? Sorry, what was the interval?
They took samples on Thursday, Friday.
3 a day? You did 3 a day
Yeah,
too?
3 a day.
Okay.
And then they reported their experience of discrimination on Friday evening. But there's a number of ways. I think the daily is the best way because you can actually start to think, like, I had an experience this day, what does my diurnal pattern look like the next
Exactly.
day?
That cross
And I
day
can't quite make that,
relation.
yes. But you get into kind of weird, like, can I make them spit 14 days? Probably not. Can I make them spit
Yeah,
7
no.
days? That's tough.
3 was the
Would swabbing
max.
Would swabbing be an,
You can swab. It depends on where in the mouth you swab. So I have a little saliva video. So part of that, when we text them, again, we semi-harass them. We text them, don't forget to spit red oxygen. I don't know if you use that.
No,
Don't
but
forget to
I-
spit. Don't forget to spit. In the body of so they get a text to their little phones because they're attached to their phones. It's like an appendage. So in the body of that text is a link to my YouTube video, which is 90 seconds, where I remind them how to spit. So they put a little swab under their tongue for a minute. So it's like I walk them through. You do this and for 90 seconds. And so every text message that they get, that link to the YouTube video is in the body. So if they forget what to do, for 90 seconds, I remind them. And you know, I look at the views because it's like a closed video, and they do look at it. And again, it's short, but it's step by step literally, it's like you take out the swab, you put it in the freezer, and it's me. So if they forget how to spit, it's just again, we semi-harass them. That's the key word here, semi. But so I don't think I could get someone to spit 14 days.
Yeah.
I find 3 days is pushing it. But well, you said something that I wanted to respond to. I don't know, but I'm interested in. You said something I can't remember.
Well, the day, like you can look at the next day.
Oh, I'm interested in the
Based on-
cross-day relation. I don't know. You said something, but anyway.
It's tough to make them spit longer. I've been part of a protocol that had 7 days.
Of spitting
Yeah.
3 times a day
Yeah.
for kids. Did they do it?
Young adults.
Oh, did they do
So,
it?
They did do it. I mean, there was some people that didn't do it, but overall, there's certain samples you don't want to miss, and it's the morning wake up and bedtime. So you kind of are a little more lenient on that second sample, but it's a little dicey.
I mean, it just depends. And the incentives come into play. I
Yes.
pay my people for this college student. Everyone gets $50 if they have to meet certain benchmarks. Incentives. Again, we text them, we email them, we try to make it easy. They can fill out the survey on their phones. They get a text message on their phones. So it's like, oh, my phone. You can look at a YouTube video on your phone. So we try to make it easy for them to do it, to remember how to do it. But some people are motivated and some people aren't. So this was the first time I was trying out this protocol. I honestly don't know if it will work with kids. I don't know. I could be wrong. I think some kids will be motivated and some won't. But for me, saliva is non-invasive because I want this to be easy. And then they can keep it in their freezers. But we retrieve it. They finish spitting on Wednesday. We're there on Thursday picking up samples because I don't want them to linger in their home freezer. So that's another thing. Like, we go and get their samples from them. I know my colleague Rona, she's doing a project saliva sample on high school and middle school kids. So she and her colleague bought a freezer for their school, and so the kids can bring it from home, and then they retrieve it there. I haven't figured that out at ASU, like some public biomarker freezer, I don't know, but we retrieve them immediately. We go to wherever they are, their homes, apartments, and we retrieve them because they have to stay frozen. So it's just been, it's a lot of moving parts at once. That's what I would say for the biomarker. I think with the daily surveys, what I did with the kids, they got emailed, and that's just kind of easy. But the saliva has added another level of complication. But I'm interested in that, so we'll see. But again, Katie's done some work with Latino youth, so.
daily surveys, 14-day daily surveys, did you look at those patterns across the 14 days?
What do you mean by patterns?
So, for instance, going back to one of the citations you used earlier, I think it was Benner, that they found in their meta-analysis that discrimination in one day predicts.
No, that was my study.
Oh, that was your study. Oh.
Right. Next day depressive symptoms.
Right.
Right.
So can you look at those kinds of patterns across the 14 days?
The cross lab.
Yes.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering is that what you presented? The cross-line patterns?
The within day and across day for the moderation. Yes.
Oh, you did. Okay. I missed
Did you possibly look at, or I actually have two questions. How variable is identity across the 14 days? Or,
Oh, God.
and then, like, that led me to think that maybe it's not daily centrality that may moderate,
It's the
but
stable trait.
yeah, like the between person effect.
Right. So, to answer your question, there is variation for public regard and I believe private. That's actually a separate paper we're working on. I think it's public and private, but not centrality. So we actually looked at the daily variation, but I think it's simpler if we go to the stable mean as the moderator, which means we can't look at the fluctuations. But that's actually an interesting empirical question because theoretically, they're supposed to be stable traits. But Robert Sellers himself is arguing, hey, look and see if these are dynamically fluid. Like I said this in the 90s, but we have the technology to see if they're fluid. And we know from some of the work on college students that they are fluid and changing. So I think that's an empirical question about whether or not there's variation on a day-to-day basis. We assume there is.
And if someone who varies more is at a disadvantage or versus someone who
Somebody
doesn't
who
vary.
does. And so is stability good or is
Yeah.
it bad? I mean, Tiffany's work is finding that stability depends on context. You know, the private regard, are they in predominantly white schools or predominantly Asian American schools? But the lived experiences of Asian Americans is not the same as the lived experience for African Americans. So then we have to qualify this in terms of who are we talking about.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to Dr. Seaton.